Here, at least anyway, that year, and we didn't manage really to do that, so we didn't get that close.
She never speaks like this, not to cameras, not to the public, and never unless something has gone terribly wrong. After a tragic discovery, Princess Anne broke her silence with an emotional statement that stunned the palace and the country. The statement that shouldn't have existed. It arrived without ceremony, without warning, and without the soft, cushioning language Buckingham Palace usually reserves for moments of internal strain. Just after dawn, as Britain moved through the muted rituals of an early winter morning, a short statement attributed to Princess Anne began circulating through official channels. It was not long, it was not dramatic, and yet it landed with a weight that immediately unsettled those who understood how rarely she speaks at all. Princess Anne does not issue emotional statements. She issues clarifications, corrections, reassurances delivered with discipline and distance. Her role inside the monarchy has always been one of restraint, the figure who steadies the institution when others hesitate. That is why this moment felt wrong from the start. Not wrong in tone, but wrong in existence. The wording was careful, almost austere. It acknowledged a tragic discovery without describing it. It referenced duty, responsibility, and the necessity of truth. And then, almost imperceptibly, it crossed a line the palace avoids unless circumstances leave no alternative. It admitted gravity. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was immediate but contained. There was no scramble, no visible panic. Instead, senior aides quietly redirected schedules, paused routine briefings, and instructed communications staff to hold all secondary releases. That kind of silence is not accidental. It is defensive. Those who have served long enough recognize the signal at once. When Princess Anne speaks emotionally, even in the most restrained way, it means internal processes have already failed to contain what has been discovered. It means something has moved beyond private correction. Outside the palace gates, the public sensed it too. Not through headlines alone, but through tone, through timing, through the fact that this statement was issued when it was early, cold, and unembellished. Older viewers, especially those who have followed the monarchy through decades of crisis, felt a familiar tightening. This was not reassurance. This was preparation. What unsettled observers most was not what Anne said, but what she did not soften. There was no promise of resolution, no assurance that matters were under control. Only the unmistakable implication that the institution had crossed into a phase where honesty could no longer wait for convenience. Within minutes, broadcasters adjusted their language. Analysts stopped speculating and started parsing. Words like serious, irreversible, and consequential replaced the usual cautious phrasing. Because when Princess Anne steps forward in this way, it is never symbolic, it is corrective. And whatever had been discovered, whatever had forced her hand, was serious enough to demand that the monarchy's most disciplined voice break her own rules. By the time the winter light fully reached the palace walls, one truth had settled in quietly but decisively. This was not the beginning of a story. It was the moment the palace acknowledged that something had already gone terribly wrong. What was found? Inside the palace, the phrase "tragic discovery" carried a gravity that outsiders could not yet fully grasp, but insiders recognized instantly. It was not a dramatic language, it was residual language. The last phrase standing after every softer alternative had been tested and removed. Words like concern, development, and complication had all failed review. What remained was not chosen for effect, but for accuracy. Within the royal system, discoveries are almost never sudden. They do not arrive as revelations or shocks. They emerge slowly, methodically, through a process designed to absorb risk before it reaches daylight. Medical professionals document observations. Advisors contextualize those findings. Private secretaries translate implications into institutional language. Only after multiple layers of verification does information reach someone like Princess Anne. By that stage, conjecture has been stripped away, optimism reduced to what can be defended, and uncertainty framed in its most honest form. That is why her reaction carried such significance. This was not a rumor intercepted or a concern escalated. It was a confirmation, something seen, reviewed, and agreed upon by individuals whose professional mandate is to prevent alarm unless alarm is unavoidable. The discovery did not widen the field of uncertainty. It narrowed it. It closed doors that had previously remained open, even if only slightly. Inside Buckingham Palace, the internal response followed a pattern reserved for moments of institutional consequence. Medical advisors were consulted again, not to challenge findings but to reconfirm them. Legal teams reviewed language not through the lens of liability but fidelity, ensuring that nothing stated or implied would later require correction. Communications officers were instructed to prepare for silence rather than explanation, a directive that carries its own meaning. When the palace chooses silence, it is often because any elaboration would mislead more than it would clarify. What had been uncovered forced a shift in posture. The institution moved from management to acknowledgement. This distinction is subtle, but critical. The palace can manage almost anything behind closed doors: illness, absence, internal strain, even scandal. What it cannot manage quietly is permanence. And whatever this discovery revealed carried the unmistakable weight of duration. It was not a passing phase to be monitored. It was a development that altered expectations. Those briefed were told essentially the same thing, though phrased differently depending on their role. This was not a moment for reassurance. This was a moment for truth, incomplete, restrained, but honest. The discovery had reshaped the internal timeline. Plans that had rested on cautious assumptions no longer aligned with reality. Contingencies that once lived on paper now required structure and consideration. Princess Anne received the briefing in the manner she has received every serious briefing of her life, without interruption, without visible reaction, without indulgence. Those present later described her demeanor not as emotional, but as profoundly still. She asked exact questions. She requested confirmation of the process. She clarified what had been ruled out and what remained unresolved. Her focus was not on outcome, but on integrity. And then she asked the one question that mattered more than any other: does this change what we believed before? The answer, delivered carefully and without dramatization, was yes. That confirmation marked the point of no return. Whatever cautious optimism had existed, however measured, could no longer be defended honestly. The discovery did not signal immediate catastrophe. It suggested something more complex and far harder to confront: limitation. Inside the palace, limitation is the most destabilizing concept of all. It does not provoke urgency. It demands adjustment, long-term thinking, structural recalibration. The kind of recalibration that forces even the most powerful institutions to accept that control has boundaries. By the time the briefing concluded, the decision had already formed, though no one articulated it aloud. Silence would no longer serve the crown, but neither would detail. The only viable path forward was acknowledgement without exposure, a narrow, precarious line that very few voices could walk without damaging credibility. Princess Anne understood this instinctively. Her authority does not stem from symbolism or popularity. It rests on trust earned over decades of saying very little and ensuring that when she does speak, every word can withstand scrutiny. When she agreed to issue a statement, it was not from inclination. It was from obligation. Silence in this instance would not have protected the institution. It would have misled it. Beyond the palace walls, the public began to sense the shift without being told its source. Regular programming was interrupted not with spectacle, but with caution. Analysts slowed their cadence. Phrases like waiting, review, and ongoing assessment replaced the usual royal shorthand. Language tightened. The tone flattened. These are signals that seasoned audiences recognize, even when details are absent. The discovery itself remained unnamed, deliberately so. Names invite speculation. Specifics invite distortion. The palace chose gravity over granularity, understanding that partial clarity can be more dangerous than restraint. And yet, even without details, the message landed. Something had been found. Something had changed. And the monarchy, through one of its most disciplined figures, had chosen to stop pretending otherwise. Why Princess Anne was chosen to speak. There are moments inside the monarchy when the central question is not what should be said, but who can say it without weakening the institution further. These moments are rare, and they are unforgiving. A misjudged voice can create panic. A familiar voice can invite disbelief. And a voice chosen for comfort rather than credibility can quietly erode trust in ways that take years to repair. This was one of those moments. Princess Anne was not chosen because she is senior, nor because she is visible, charismatic, or reassuring. She was chosen because she is believed. In a family frequently accused of choreography, performance, and narrative calculation, Anne has spent a lifetime doing the opposite. She does not soften language to spare feelings, she does not perform empathy for public consumption, and she does not speak unless the cost of silence has risen higher than the risk of truth. Inside the palace, that distinction is not philosophical, it is operational. Within the monarchy, there exists a quiet hierarchy of voices. Some are designed to soothe uncertainty. Some exist to explain complexity in manageable terms. Others are deployed to redirect attention away from discomfort. And then there are the few whose role is far more severe, to signal consequence. Princess Anne belongs to that final category. When she speaks publicly, it is understood that internal debate has already ended. That understanding is not symbolic. It is procedural. Those closest to her later described the moment she was asked to step forward, not as hesitation, but as reluctant acceptance. She did not argue. She did not ask for a delay. She did not question whether speaking would be well received. Instead, she asked for clarity. Not emotional clarity, but procedural clarity. What had been confirmed beyond doubt? What had been ruled out definitively? What could no longer be responsibly implied or allowed to linger in ambiguity? Only after those questions were answered did she agree. This is the part often misunderstood by those outside the institution. Anne's authority does not come from rank alone. It comes from restraint, from decades of choosing silence when others rush to explain, from absorbing pressure without complaint, from carrying responsibility without demanding recognition. Her credibility is built not on presence, but on absence. She speaks so rarely that when she does, the assumption is not intention, but necessity. The emotional weight of her statement did not come from its wording. It came from the breach of her own discipline. Anne has built her authority by never appearing reactive. Her composure is her currency. To spend it, even partially, meant the situation demanded it, and that alone carried meaning. In private, those who observed her in the hours before the statement noted something subtly different. Not distress, not fear, but a kind of concentrated gravity. She moved more slowly through corridors she knew by instinct. She spoke less, not from uncertainty, but from focus. Drafts were reviewed not to refine tone, but to remove anything that hinted at reassurance she could not personally stand behind. This was not a performance. It was a boundary. Her insistence was simple and absolute. If she was to speak, she would not soften what could not be softened. She would not imply outcomes that could not be guaranteed, and she would not offer comfort that she herself did not believe. That standard removed entire categories of language from consideration. When her statement came, it carried no flourish, no emotional appeal, no attempt to guide reaction. And yet it resonated precisely because it acknowledged something the palace almost never acknowledges publicly, that a line had been crossed not by choice, but by discovery. Those circumstances had overtaken preference. That control had limits. Anne understands the difference between crisis and reckoning. Crisis invites urgency, reaction, and optics. Reckoning demands acceptance. Her words signaled the latter. They did not call for action. They confirmed reality. Why her and not anyone else? Because she is not perceived as protecting an image. She is perceived as protecting a standard. For decades, she has embodied a version of duty that predates modern media logic. She has spoken plainly when others deferred. She has carried out responsibility without public validation. She has endured criticism without rebuttal. That history cannot be replicated by press officers, advisors, or polished statements. It gives her words a credibility no institutional release could ever manufacture. To the public, particularly those who have followed the monarchy across generations, her involvement sent a clear signal. This was not a communications exercise. This was not narrative management. This was an internal acknowledgement made external because containment was no longer honest. Behind closed doors, There was full awareness that Anne's words would be examined with unusual care. Every pause, every omission, every choice of phrasing. But that scrutiny was precisely why she was chosen. She would not overpromise, she would not speculate, and she would not retreat from the weight of what had been uncovered. Her statement achieved something exceedingly rare. It prepared the ground emotionally without explaining the terrain. It allowed the public to register seriousness without being invited into panic, and it did so without violating the institution's need for privacy. That balance is almost impossible to strike. Almost. Princess Anne struck it because she was willing to accept the cost. Once spoken, her words could not be withdrawn, clarified, or softened later. They would stand on their own. They would mark a dividing line, before the discovery and after it. And she understood that in agreeing to speak, she would carry that line with her indefinitely. In doing so, she did not become the source of alarm. She confirmed that the alarm was already justified. Inside the palace, when the truth settled. By the time Princess Anne's statement reached the public, the true reckoning had already taken place behind the thick stone walls of Buckingham Palace. What unfolded there was not chaos. It was something far more unsettling. Acceptance. The night before the statement, senior figures moved through a sequence of meetings that were deliberately small and deliberately quiet. There were no full assemblies, no dramatic summons, no visible urgency meant to signal crisis. Instead, there were carefully selected rooms, limited attendance, and conversations held in voices lowered not out of secrecy, but out of respect for what was being acknowledged. This was not a moment that required speed. It required containment. Within the palace, urgency is reserved for instability. This moment was something else entirely. When discoveries of this nature surface, the monarchy does not respond emotionally. It responds structurally. Schedules are reviewed not to cancel engagements, but to introduce elasticity. Language is pared back to essentials. Contingency folders, some untouched for years, are removed from shelves and placed on tables without commentary. Their presence alone communicates gravity. No one needs to ask why they are there. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Those present later described a moment midway through one late briefing when the room fell silent, not because someone had finished speaking, but because there was nothing left to debate. The information had been verified, independent confirmations aligned. The implications had been mapped carefully and conservatively. Scenarios had been discussed, tested, and set aside. What remained was not a decision, but an adjustment. This is where the distinction between public drama and institutional reality becomes most apparent. The palace is built to absorb shock. It has survived scandal, conflict, abdication, public fury, and sudden loss with remarkable composure. What it is not designed to do is deny permanence, and the discovery that had triggered Princess Anne's intervention belonged unmistakably to that category. Permanence changes everything. Senior advisors recalibrated their language almost immediately. Words such as temporary and precautionary were quietly removed from internal documents, not because they were inaccurate in isolation, but because they were no longer defensible as commitments. The palace does not promise what it cannot guarantee. To do so would invite a future reckoning far more damaging than restraint ever could be. Private secretaries took notes with an intensity usually reserved for constitutional matters. Medical briefings were revisited not to challenge conclusions, but to understand limitations with precision. Legal advisors focused less on exposure and more on precedent, aware that how the institution behaves now would quietly shape expectations for years to come. When something cannot be undone, the monarchy's instinct is not to resist it, but to ensure it is navigated with discipline. One aide later described the atmosphere as winter logic, the recognition that certain seasons do not permit growth, only survival. It was not despair, it was realism, the kind that strips away excess and leaves only what must be preserved. Princess Anne remained present throughout these discussions. She did not dominate them, she anchored them. Her role was not to direct outcomes, but to enforce clarity. She did not argue for disclosure. She argued against illusion. There is a critical difference. Her position was simple, consistent, and unyielding. Whatever the palace chose to say publicly, it could not mislead itself privately first. That insistence shaped everything that followed. Across the palace, routine slowed. This shift was invisible to the public but unmistakable internally. Decisions that once moved quickly were paused, not from indecision, but from recognition. Once a certain line has been crossed, speed becomes less valuable than accuracy. Pretending otherwise offers no advantage. This is the part of royal life rarely seen or acknowledged. The hours where continuity is preserved not through optimism, but through realism. Where tradition is not invoked to comfort, but to discipline. Where restraint is not weakness, but responsibility. Corridors that usually hummed with quiet efficiency grew still. Offices remained lit long after midnight, not because of panic, but because recalibration takes time. Adjustments made carefully last longer than decisions made quickly. The institution was not collapsing. It was reorienting. What changed most noticeably was tone, not in words but in posture. Conversations became more deliberate. Assumptions were questioned gently but firmly. Planning documents were rewritten not to alarm, but to reflect altered realities. The palace did not seek to regain certainty. It accepted that certainty had narrowed. By the early hours of the morning, it was clear that the monarchy had entered a different posture. Not an emergency, not retreat, something quieter and more enduring. A posture shaped by the understanding that whatever had been discovered would now influence planning, messaging, and expectation for the foreseeable future. This was no longer about managing a moment. It was about living within a new frame. It was in this atmosphere that the final decision took form. Princess Anne would speak. The palace would confirm seriousness without elaboration, and the public would be trusted to understand what could not yet be responsibly explained. There was no sense of relief attached to this decision, only necessity. No one mistook acknowledgement for resolution. The statement would not close questions. It would formalize gravity. When dawn came, Buckingham Palace did not wake to the crisis. It woke to consequence. The kind that does not demand reaction, but adaptation. The kind that reshapes behavior without announcing itself. The kind that marks a before and an after, even if no one names it aloud. From that morning onward, the institution moved differently. Not visibly, not dramatically, but with a quiet awareness that something essential had settled into place. Not fear, not panic, but truth. And once truth replaces uncertainty inside the palace, there is no return to the way things were before. The public learns without being told. The public did not need details to understand that something had shifted. They felt it in the pauses between words, in the careful absence of reassurance, in the unusual decision to let a single statement stand without clarification or follow-up. In a media environment accustomed to constant explanation, that restraint was itself a message. This is how gravity communicates when elaboration would only distort it. Across Britain, the reaction was not loud. It was quiet, reflective, and unusually restrained. Radio call-ins slowed rather than surged. Presenters adjusted their tones, speaking more deliberately, leaving more space between questions. Commentators chose language with care, avoiding speculation not because it was forbidden, but because it felt inappropriate. Even the tabloids, so often driven by appetite rather than instinct, hesitated. There are moments when sensation yields to seriousness, and this was one of them. Older audiences in particular recognized the pattern almost immediately. Those who had lived through decades of royal turbulence understood what they were seeing. Not a crisis being managed, but a boundary being acknowledged. They had seen moments like this before, not often, but often enough to know when the institution had shifted posture. What unsettled people most was not fear. It was uncertain. The statement had not promised resolution. It had not offered a timeline. It had not suggested improvement or decline. It had simply affirmed that a discovery had occurred and that it mattered enough to break with established practice. In a culture accustomed to being guided through royal narratives step by step, this absence of guidance spoke louder than any explanation could have. Silence, when it follows a moment like this, is never empty. It is deliberate, and the public sensed that whatever had been found was not something that could be responsibly discussed in fragments. Partial information would have invited misunderstanding, distortion, and false certainty. So instead, the palace offered something far rarer than detail. It offered trust. Trust that the audience could read the tone, trust that they could interpret restraint, trust that they would understand some truths requires space before they can be named. For many, that trust was unsettling, but also deeply respectful. It treated the public not as consumers of spectacle, but as participants in a shared moment of seriousness. The monarchy did not ask for sympathy. It did not ask for patience. It did not attempt to frame a reaction. It acknowledged reality and stepped back. In the absence of detail, people did not immediately fill the space with rumors. Instead, many filled it with reflection. Conversations turned inward rather than outward. What does it mean when institutions built on continuity admit disruption? What does it mean when a system designed to project stability pauses long enough to acknowledge limitation? What does it mean when the most disciplined voice among them allows emotion to surface, even briefly? The statement issued by Princess Anne became the focal point of this reflection, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it refused to pretend. It did not disguise the weight of the discovery. It did not rush to soften its implications. It stood alone, unembellished, and asked to be taken seriously. That is why it lingered. In the days that followed, commentators continued returning to the statement, not to dissect individual words, but to understand implication. They spoke less about what might have been discovered and more about what had changed and how the palace was speaking at all. That tonal shift, more than any hypothetical detail, suggested permanence. In households far removed from palace walls, people felt a familiar ache, the kind that surfaces when something long trusted enters a phase of waiting rather than resolution. It was not a drama they were responding to. It was recognition. The recognition of a moment everyone understands, regardless of station or status. The moment when certainty gives way to monitoring, when optimism yields to realism, when institutions, like families, must accept that some things cannot be hurried toward closure. In those moments, people do not need answers as much as they need honesty. And honesty, in this case, arrived not as explanation, but as restraint. By saying less, the palace had communicated more. It had signaled that this was not a story to be consumed quickly, debated loudly, or resolved neatly. It was a development that required time, care, and a recalibration of expectation. And by choosing Princess Anne as the voice of that communication, the palace ensured the message would land not as spectacle, but as truth, incomplete, controlled, and therefore credible. The public understood that instinctively. They did not need to be told what to think. They understood what they were being asked to do instead: to wait, to listen, and to recognize when silence itself has meaning. What this moment signals. In the monarchy, moments like this are rarely marked by ceremony. They are marked by recalibration. The emotional statement issued by Princess Anne did not close a chapter. It opened a quieter, more demanding one. A chapter defined not by decisive action, but by vigilance. Not by reassurance, but by realism. And above all, by the acceptance that something fundamental has shifted, even if its full shape cannot yet be named. What this moment signals is not collapse. It signals a boundary. The palace has crossed from a phase of management into a phase of adaptation, and that distinction matters more than it may appear. Management assumes control. It relies on planning, confidence, and the belief that outcomes can be guided with sufficient care. Adaptation accepts limits. It acknowledges that some developments cannot be steered, only responded to with discipline and restraint. Institutions built on continuity resist this transition for as long as possible, because it forces them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Not every challenge can be absorbed without cost. Princess Anne's involvement made that truth unavoidable. Her words were not an appeal for sympathy. They were an act of stewardship. She stepped forward not to dramatize what had been discovered, but to anchor the institution to honesty at a moment when optimism would have been easier and far more dangerous. Optimism, when it cannot be defended, erodes trust. Anne's intervention ensured that trust was preserved, even at the price of discomfort. Internally, this moment will reshape planning for months and possibly longer. Language will remain cautious. Appearances will be measured. Decisions will be filtered through a new awareness that certain assumptions no longer hold. This will not be announced. It never is. The monarchy does not explain its adjustments. It embodies them. Shifts appear not in statements, but in timing, not in declarations, but in absence. Externally, the public has been invited, quietly and without ceremony, into a different kind of relationship with the institution. One not built on reassurance or spectacle, but on shared seriousness. The palace did not attempt to direct a reaction. It did not flood the moment with commentary. It chose instead to trust restraint. That trust cuts both ways. For those watching closely, particularly those with enough lived experience to understand how institutions protect themselves, the signal is unmistakable. This is not a moment that will be resolved quickly. It is a moment that will be navigated carefully. The absence of urgency is not indifference, it is recognition. Princess Anne's statement will endure as a marker, the point at which silence stopped being protective and started being misleading, the point at which discipline required acknowledgement rather than deflection. These moments are rare because they carry risk. Once acknowledged, reality cannot be returned to its earlier framing. There is courage in that choice, though it is rarely described in such terms. Courage in institutions does not look like bold gestures or dramatic announcements. It looks like the willingness to speak when silence would be safer, and the discipline to stop speaking when explanation would be dishonest. What comes next will not arrive as a single moment. It will unfold slowly, in pauses, in absences, in subtle shifts that only time reveals. The monarchy will continue, as it always has, but altered in ways that will not be immediately visible. Continuity does not mean stasis. It means endurance through change. And Princess Anne will return, as she always has, to her quiet role. Having spoken once, clearly and deliberately, she will not elaborate. She will not revisit. She will not soften what has already been understood. That restraint is not avoidance, it is complete. That too is part of the signal. Because some discoveries do not demand answers, they demand responsibility. And in this moment, responsibility has been acknowledged, not loudly, not completely, but truthfully enough to matter. As this story settles into silence, one truth remains clear. Moments like this redefine institutions more than any headline ever could. If you followed this unfolding with care, I invite you to stay connected as events continue to develop. Share your thoughts respectfully, subscribe for verified updates, and join this conversation wherever you're watching from. In times like these, attention and discernment matter more than ever.